Okay, it is now recording, so we should be all set. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you and just again want to thank you for being with us. And I want to thank Karen for setting this up. This is really great. So thank you so much, and we'll turn it over to you.
No, thank you, Julie. I really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, Karen, really been an honor to get to know Karen Gustafson, Executive Director of JFS. We've done a project together and she's doing great work. So thanks for making this connection. I'm going to begin with a little story about an elderly woman because I think it's a good icebreaker. It was either that or, by the way, pander. Pandering is not beneath me. So just for the record, I'm just saying I could wear this the whole time if it keeps your eyes on me. But I know there's Zoom fatigue, and that's why I wanted to share with you the following. So there's a little elderly woman, and she goes to her local church. And she goes in, and she's greeted by a very friendly usher. And he says to her, "Where would you like to sit?" And she says, "The front row." And he's like, "You don't really want to sit in the front row." He's like, "No." She says, "No, I really do." "No, you really don't. The pastor, incredibly boring. He'll put you to sleep." The woman says indignantly, "Do you know who I am?" The man says, "I do not." She says, "I'm the pastor's mother." To which the man says, "Do you know who I am?" She says, "I do not." He says, "Good." And he leaves out the back door. I say that for three reasons. One, my mother's on the call, so be careful. Jan Goldstein's on the call. Number two, I am a pastor, and is it a job hazard? We put people to sleep sometimes, so I will try not to. I've been grappling with Zoom and how the best to present. I've done PowerPoints, I've done none. I'm going to stay away from it. I think it kind of distracts and makes it hard enough. And number three, right, you got the front row, so there is no escaping out the back door. But I will try and keep it relatively brief. I was told 30 minutes. Actually 28 more minutes and 30 seconds. I'm very considerate of your time, unlike a lot of my colleagues. So
you can go honestly till, sorry to interrupt, but till 9:30ish, if that works, if you have more material to cover. We don't want to rush you.
You know, Julie, obviously you haven't worked with that many pastors. You never give them an open-ended ticket. Okay. You can always hit the back door, and I will understand. But I'm really excited, even if it's Zoom. I was hoping to be there in person, but I will take Zoom, and maybe we'll get together down the road if you'll have me. So again, my name is Baruch Halevi. Somehow, some reason, my friends in Nebraska never want to say Baruch. I can't quite understand it. And actually, I start seeing them sweat when my friends from Nebraska say Baruch. So I don't make them say Baruch. They just call me B, or Rabbi B. For about 20 years, I've been a rabbi. I was a synagogue rabbi for 15 of those years, Los Angeles, and then right next door to you all, Des Moines, Iowa. And then most of my time was spent right outside of Boston in Swampscott, Massachusetts. About 5 years ago, I retired. I am a retired rabbi. And my wife and I moved to Israel to pursue a lifelong dream it's called making Aliyah, becoming Israeli citizens. So we're dual citizens. Took our 4 kids, went there, came back about a year ago because we had a dream to start a center of spirituality, meaning, healing for anybody, any tradition, religious, not religious. I'd say the good majority of our folks are spiritual, quote unquote, not religious, kind of recovering Jews, grappling with their Christianity, unchurched, unsynagogued, spiritual mutts, seeking meaning and healing in the afternoon of life. Student of Carl Jung, Dr. Jung, who talks about the afternoon of life. And so soul-centered is a place for people to come to learn new goals, new rules, new tools in the afternoon of life, because the afternoon of life is very different than the morning of life. Afternoon of life, midlife onwards. Jung says up until 40, it's all research. And so we help people put the research to action. And there's nowhere more important than to have a place to learn new goals, new rules, and new tools than the afternoon of life around loss. Because any of us who have made it to the afternoon of life have known loss, all kinds of loss. And so my wife, Ariella, and I co-founded Soul Centered so we could counsel individuals through all types of loss. My area of passion, and I would say humbly expertise, is around guiding people through grief, but all types of grief and loss, especially the death of a loved one, and particularly death by suicide, by people who've completed suicide. And so I work with clients individually now, and we provide experiences around grief, but also spirituality, meaning, and healing. On Father's Day, we did a memorial remembrance service for people whose father no longer walked this earth. You know, these are one of those holidays, the shadows don't really come into play. Mother's Day we did, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah. You know, we live in a Facebook culture, and we're going to talk about that. And so we need to provide opportunities for people to do what Jung and I call shadow work, to go into the shadows, to move through them. And that's the nature of this conversation. I want to talk to you about that. So I have a doctoral degree in ministry, pastoral counseling. I went back to school and got that. I'm a logotherapist, meaning-centered therapy. I'll tell you more about that. I've done about 500 funerals. I'd say maybe 15, 20 of them were suicide. I've written a book called Spark Seekers, Mourning with Meaning, Living with Light. Spark Seekers is a Kabbalistic Jewish mystical idea, which I'll tell you about that. And last but not least, I'll tell you about my personal journey, having survived loss due to suicide. And that's where I'm going to start. So actually, I am from the Holy Land, in case you don't know, and I've lived in Israel, but that's not where I'm from. It's actually not pandering when I wear this hat, because this is my birthplace, right? I am born and bred Omaha, Nebraska, Cornhuskers all the way. I'm fourth generation, born and raised in Omaha. Anybody go to Burke High School? You can't really see because there's so many of you, but Burke High School, class of 1990. I changed my name. I was Jason Perlman. I was not escaping the law. It's no dark, sinister reasons why I changed my name. I was living in Israel, and they couldn't say Jason. So I changed it to Baruch, my Hebrew name, long conversation. Bottom line, it's not how I grew up. I grew up in Omaha, Jason Perlman, and very proud of it. Had an amazing childhood in Omaha, right across the street from Boys Town, by the way. Candlewood, Heavenly Acres, and Royalwood, where I grew up. So I'm very familiar with the amazing place that our friends on the coast call the flyover states. Let them keep flying over, right? It keeps our traffic a little bit lighter. Although last time I was in Omaha, I was a little surprised. You have a little traffic. I loved it. And I had an amazing childhood. I'd say my childhood ended when I was 15 and a half years old. I came home from school one day. I was driving. We lived in one of those weird zone days. I got my license at 15 and a half. I was driving, shouldn't have been driving. I came home from school and pulled into my driveway and saw all these cars in my driveway, unusual amount of cars. I go in and somebody, I don't know, it was a blur, somebody had told me my grandmother killed herself, my paternal grandmother. First thing I did, I jumped in the car and I raced across town, even though I wasn't supposed to drive anywhere but to and from school. I drove across town to my grandparents' house. They lived off of 70th and Dodge. And I was the third or fourth person on the scene. My grandfather had called my father. My grandmother had shot herself, had found his gun and completed suicide. After many, many attempts, by the way, and I'll tell you more about that. My father was devastated. I think the paramedics came right after that, took her away, and I got there right after the paramedics. And I just remember 15 and a half, 30 plus years ago. And I still remember the day like it was yesterday. My father just grabbed me. It was just like this primal release. He needed his son, his child, and he just held me. And I just remember being in the nape of his neck, him squeezing my hair and holding me tight and screaming at the top of his lungs, why, over and over again. And I can't explain it. I couldn't explain it then, but I knew it, and I can explain it now. Something more than just my grandmother died in that moment. In that moment, my dad died. It would take him another 2 decades or so to actually die, but something began to descend in his life that I've seen over and over again. I call it the dark, destructive silence. A silence, right? Just kind of descended in our life, in his life. The silence had always been there. Growing up, there were a lot of things that were off limits to talk about. I'm sure many of you grew up in the same era I did, same place in Omaha, Nebraska, although it wasn't that different around the country or the world. There were certain things that were off limits. We weren't allowed to talk about my grandmother's depression, and she had depression. I just remember even trying to bring it up. It was off limits. We weren't allowed to talk about the fact that she attempted suicide multiple times before that, and we all knew it. We weren't allowed to talk about, I call them the dark Ds, depression, death. Death was totally off limits. Divorce, 6 or 7 aunts and uncles. Divorce was becoming a thing then, but at the time, weren't allowed to talk about it. My parents ended up divorced. My grandparents ended up divorced. All my aunts and uncles ended up divorced. Off limits. There was so much that was off limits, and I just remember feeling like I was suffocating in silence. I know my dad was. A few years later, so interesting, I got the chills just saying this. We were on a walk in Boys Town, in the beautiful, down near the pond. And I said to him, Dad, you're sinking. And he yelled at me. He screamed at me and saying, I'm not. It's none of your business. You're too young. You can't understand. I hadn't thought about that Boys Town incident, where we were. I thought about the incident. I went home and I wrote him out the lyrics to his favorite group and his favorite song, Simon and Garfunkel, Sounds of Silence. Right? Maybe you remember it. Fools, said I, you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms that I might reach you. But my words like silent raindrops fell and echoed in the wells of silence. I begged my dad to listen, but those words just echoed in the wells of silence for him. And I watched him come undone and fall apart under the weight of that silence, ultimately throwing away his marriage to my mother, throwing away his business, throwing away his community, born and bred in Omaha, cut out his friends, cut out his community, left his community. And in the moment he did, it's what philosopher Will Herberg calls cut flower syndrome. You can cut flowers and take them out of the garden, but the moment you cut them, they're dying. They may look okay, but they're dying. My dad was dying in his silence, to the point where 25 years later, on October 11th, 2006, about the same age I was when his mother killed herself, about the same age he was when his mother killed herself, my father killed himself. He hung himself, unlike his mother who shot herself. And in that moment, I knew that the chain had to be broken. I screamed, why, by the way. The person who told me, my cantor, the kind of the rabbi's partner in a synagogue. I grew up in Omaha at Bethel Synagogue over on Dodge Street. Also, Temple Emmanuel, my mentor, Rabbi Aryeh Azrael, amazing man. He wasn't there when I was growing up, but we became close afterwards. And send my love and prayers to Aryeh. I'm sure many of you know them. His beloved wife just passed. Please give him your condolences. I remember screaming, why? Because my cantor who told me the news, I was working in Boston, was my cantor growing up in Omaha, Emil Berkovitz. And Emil just held me while I screamed, why? But here's the difference, right? He or she who has a big enough why, says Nietzsche, can endure anyhow. It's not ironic. Those words were why. My dad didn't have a why. My grandmother didn't have a why. I had a why. And I want to talk to you about that why, because I believe that why is the defining difference between my dad and me and my grandmother. There are a lot of factors that go into suicide. There is never a factor. All kinds of factors. The dark, destructive silence is a primary factor. I've yet to meet anybody whose loved one didn't complete suicide without feeling the destruction of the silence that I've been describing. Nonetheless, I knew my why, and I wasn't going to live in silence. I was going to shatter the silence. And I turned to the Bible, I turned to the Torah, our shared wisdom tradition for many on this call. And the words from Deuteronomy, right? To choose life. Uvacharta b'chaim, it says, choose life. And I reread it in a different way. Because if you look at the verse, it says, choose life. Why? So that you may live, but so that your children may live. And when it comes to surviving the loss due to suicide, there is a mantra and a mission of choosing life that is no longer taken for granted. Anybody here who survived knows it becomes an obvious choice, or not so obvious choice, but it becomes a blatant choice. And I made that choice. And I said I was going to choose life at all costs. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. What does it mean to choose life? How do we guide other people who have survived loss by suicide to choose life? How do we go out and do your amazing work of this coalition to help others choose life? I've boiled it down into 3 simple, I hope not simplistic, but simple steps, if you will. They're not really steps, they're phases or aspects to this. We're going to talk through them in the remaining 15 minutes or so. And that is part 1. You got to name the darkness. You've got to give it voice, give it words. Number 2, you've got to face the darkness. You've got to mindfully, intentionally walk into the darkness. And number 3, you've got to replace the darkness with something bigger, with that why. So we're going to talk about naming it, facing it, and replacing it. So number 1, in my journey and in counseling and guiding others, you can't tame it until you name it. They say in the recovery world, in the self-help world, if you can't name it, it has power. It has absolute power. Right? It was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who said, absolute silence leads to absolute sorrow. It is the image of death. Absolute silence is the most destructive thing I have ever experienced in my life and guiding other people. There's holy silence. I don't get that. I got 4 little kids. I got a busy life. I have to go make holy silence. But then there's a lot of unholy silence. And that's the silence I'm talking about. It's the silence that has pervaded our culture around a lot of subjects. Most subjects are no longer taboo. There aren't many taboo subjects anymore. I mean, growing up, 1986 to 1990 at Burke High School, if one was gay, you would never come out in 1986 in Omaha, Nebraska. I hope times have changed. I know they've changed to some degrees. Are they perfect? Probably not. Are they better? They have to be infinitely in certain areas where you can talk about things far more freely than we could years back. There are certain areas that are amazingly stunted, like death. You know, of those 500 funerals, a good percentage obviously were older folks, 80s, 90s. How many of them didn't have their funeral arrangements? So many. These were successful businessmen and women and professionals out in the world succeeding, and yet they wouldn't face their death. We have a culture that outsources death, right? You go to the nursing home, you go to the funeral home. We don't talk about it. Everybody's freaked out by it. It's overwhelming and nobody wants to talk about it. I'm like the buzzkill when I start talking about death in social settings. Why? It's part of life, but it's still taboo. But within death, right, not all things are equal. Suicide is still off limits. I'm not going to spend my time preaching to the choir, telling you about the statistics of the suicide epidemic, the silent epidemic. Very few epidemics anymore, but this is one of them, taking so many lives in so many categories. And I think about my friends who are veterans or active military, who are struggling and can't talk about it, don't even know how to talk about it, have nobody to talk to about this stuff. Elderly or teens, everybody in between. This is a massive problem, and yet we still don't talk about suicide. When my dad killed himself, I was brand new to the Boston community and the synagogue there. A congregant, a parishioner, comes up to me and says, "Rabbi, you've been blogging about suicide." And I just want to tell you, this is New England. This was 2006, by the way. Not necessarily the dark ages, but his response felt like the dark ages. He said, "We don't talk about suicide here in New England. So we'd appreciate it if you did, and it makes us uncomfortable." So what did I do? In Hebrew, we call it a nudnik. I guess in English, you translate it as a pain in the ass. I don't know how to translate nudnik. Forgive me. I got up in front of 2,000 people on Yom Kippur, the high holy days, and I said I was told not to bring the subject up. But my job as a pastor, a friend of mine once taught me, is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And we are too comfortable around the silence around death in general and suicide in particular. And so I gave a talk, it's still online, you can read it or watch it on YouTube, about the epidemic of suicide. And by the end, I had everybody up saying, if you've been touched by suicide directly, indirectly, a friend of a friend, thousands of people up on their feet, singing to a kids' choir, "Lean on Me," tears in people's eyes, while I'm shouting the words, "Never again." And as a Jew, those words don't come lightly. Never again is what we say after the Holocaust. Never again will we allow 6 million people to go to their deaths in silence, up in smoke in the ovens of Auschwitz while the world watches idly by. We must say the same thing about suicide. Never again will we allow somebody to suffer, sit, decay in silence when we could have been there, should have been there, and you all are doing this. We need more of you and coalitions like the one you've all inspired. We have to go shatter the silence, right? It says in the Psalms, "Lo ametim tahalel Yahweh, lo kol yordei duma." The dead cannot praise you, God, and neither can those go down in silence. And what I said to these 2,000 people is, I will not go down in silence, and you should not go down in silence. It begins with bringing voice to people's silence, right? I get from my brothers and sisters in the Christian tradition from the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, with God, and the Word was God. There's divinity in words. Remember that stupid saying? "Sticks and stones will break my bones, and words will never hurt me." Ridiculous. Sticks and stones will only break your bones. Words will destroy you. The presence of destructive words, the absence of constructive words. We become godly, co-creators, life-savers when we help others find their voice, the power of their words. It's what I do in counseling. It's what you all do with your organizations to help people, victims who have lost their voice. in 1,000 different ways, find their voice, whether they're surviving loss or whether they're contemplating leaving. Words are the beginning point. You got to name it to tame it. Number 2, name the darkness, face the darkness. People will say, okay, I get naming it. I get giving voice to it, counseling, therapy, all this wonderful stuff. What do you mean face it? Who doesn't face the darkness? I just described to you around death and suicide, we run from the darkness. There's this great Sufi teaching about a mystic who comes along a man who's searching underneath a street lamp hundreds of years ago. He says, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my keys. Can I help you? Absolutely. So the mystic gets down on his knees and starts looking. The mystic says, whereabouts did you lose the keys? I lost them over there in the shadows. Why are we looking here? Because this is where the light is. That's how we treat a lot of these issues. We don't want to face the darkness. So what happens when death comes, regardless of how it comes, but especially by suicide? We do what I call is the void dance, avoidance, a void dance, a dance around the void. There's a void that descends in our lives individually, families, collectively, communally, societally. And so we just start dancing around it and we try and numb the pain. I would say that even more destructive, than illicit narcotics, which are a deep problem in our society, and alcohol, which are approved of narcotics, are other things like eating and shopping and television, because they're silent and they're subtle and they're socially acceptable. I like alliteration. Sorry, I get into the alliteration sometimes. Forgive me. That's the void dance. We dance around the void because we don't want to face what's in it. But there's only one way through the void, and that is through the void. We've got to deal with the monsters. Stephen King, the author of Monsters, said monsters are real. They don't live in books. They don't live out in the world. They live in our head, and sometimes they win. Monsters are real. And the only way to deal with a monster when you're a child, you go into your children's room, there are no monsters in your closet. How do we know? Let's look into the closet. There are no monsters down in you. We have to simply open the closet and go into it and look at what they are offering to tell us. No matter how dark and destructive and difficult and painful it might be, there's always possibilities. I call them sparks of meaning, of potential, of even blessing in the darkness, no matter how dark it is. This isn't my idea. This is a few thousand years old, coming from Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. And this is the title where I got my book, Spark Seekers, from. Kabbalistic idea is a universal idea, but the Kabbalists really give voice to it. And they say all life begins in the darkness, the Big Bang, right? They didn't have the language Big Bang, but the universe began in darkness. A baby begins in the mother's womb, a place of darkness. All life begins in darkness. We have to go into it and find the darkness, right? Out of emergency comes emergence. And so I work with people, you all are helping people to name the darkness, to face the darkness proactively. We live in a society that doesn't want imperfect, ugly, painful darkness, so we avoid it. But we have to reframe this. A great Kabbalist once said, there is nothing more whole than a shattered heart. There's nothing more whole than a shattered heart. Don't cover over your darkness. What did my dad say? Every time I reached out to him after his mother's death, and anybody did, how are you doing, Dad? What did he say? You know what he said because you hear it from the people you love or guide. I'm fine. I'm fine. I just counseled a woman whose father, we'll call her Mary, her father jumped off a cliff about 2 months ago. First conversation, Mary, how are you? I'm fine, Rabbi. I'm fine. I said, Mary, your father just jumped off a cliff and you mean to tell me you're fine? Well, actually, ... And for the last 2 months, we've been talking about how she's not fine. And I've finally gotten through the society's message. Who the hell wants to be fine? I don't want to be fine after my loved one just died. I want to be anything but fine. It's like one of these funerals I officiate at where I'm told, whatever you do, don't make us cry. What? Don't make us cry. This should be a celebration of life. It should be happy. I don't begrudge anybody for wanting to celebrate life, but if you can't cry at a funeral, when the hell are you going to cry? And what are tears for, if not to be felt, right? You can't heal it unless you feel it. My wife teaches a lot on healing. She teaches me this. You got to feel it. You got to face it. You got to move through it. Get to this place where there's a new type of perfection. It's the perfection of imperfection. It's the wholeness of being broken, embracing it. I know everybody knows Brene Brown. Brene Brown teaches on courage, coming from this place of wholehearted. Courage means heart, to take your shattered heart, to hold it, and to move forward in your life. And so it's about naming it, facing it, and replacing it. And this is the last piece of the puzzle. Thank you, Tiffany. Preach on. Reading the chats. So feel free to chat. And I want to take some questions here in a few minutes, so feel free to also share your questions in the chat. So name it, face it, replace it. I want to tell you a quick story about a man we're going to call 119104. Why do I call him 119104? By the way, I wear his number on my arm, even though you're not supposed to wear tattoos in Judaism. I have his literally name tattooed across my arm, and I'll tell you why. And it says 119104. That's how I know the number. He had everything taken from him. He had his wife murdered. He had his parents murdered. He had his siblings murdered. He had his community murdered. And he went to Auschwitz. He went to 2 other camps and then was interred in Auschwitz for the remainder of the Holocaust. And yet he was one of these great men and women, like Nelson Mandela, like Martin Luther King, like Natan Sharansky. There's so many of them who would say something to the effect of, I was in prison, but I was never imprisoned. They put me behind bars, but I was always a free man. He said the following out of the Holocaust: we who lived in the concentration camp can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer us sufficient proof. Everything can be taken from a man or woman, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. Prisoner 119104's name was Dr. Viktor Frankel. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning and 32 other books. He's the founder of the 3rd Viennese school of psychotherapy called logotherapy. Logo means meaning. It also means word from the Bible, but it ultimately means truth or meaning. It's meaning-centered therapy. Dr. Frankel took his experience of the Holocaust and found his sparks. And his spark became helping other people find their sparks within the darkness, finding meaning and purpose and blessing and possibility out of what would have been otherwise destruction. If he can do it out of the Holocaust, I can do it in my struggle-filled life, and the people we guide can do it in their lives. I've seen over and over again that this idea of logotherapy, and you don't have to subscribe to the particular therapy, you all know it, you all live it. That's why you're part of this coalition. Dr. Frankel's thesis was, life has meaning under all circumstances. We have a need, a primal need. Freud said we have a need for pleasure. Adler said we had a need for power. Frankel said we have a need for meaning. What people need on the other side of loss, or those who are contemplating suicide, is something bigger than themselves. She who has a big enough why can endure anyhow. They need a why. What I spend my time doing, obviously what you all spend your time doing, is helping people remember their why, discover their why out of that darkness. And it's a new why. When your loved one kills themselves, when you survive death by suicide, everything changes. Nothing is the same. And yet it can be beautiful again if you have a new definition of beautiful, right? Perfectly imperfect. The shattered wholeness. It can't be the way it was, but that's not the choice. I'd take my dad back in a heartbeat. I'd trade it all in to have my dad, Shelley Perlman, back again. Last I checked, I wasn't given the choice. So either I leave him in the tragedy of his suicide, my grandmother in the tragedy of her suicide, and dishonor them by following in their footsteps, or by surviving. Because you know what? Surviving is not an end, it's a means. It is not enough to survive. We owe it to our loved ones to thrive. At some point, not right away, we need to feel the pain, we need to work through the darkness, but at some point, we need to come out the other side of the darkness. There's this beautiful practice in Judaism called sitting Shiva. Shiva is 7 days after somebody dies. You sit in the darkness, literally, figuratively, for sure, for 7 days. On the 7th day, you stand up, whether you want to or not, and you walk around the block with a friend. You go back out into the light. At some point after the death, and I don't care what type of death it is, we have to stand up and go out back into the world to discover light. And maybe the light is just living and bringing other people life. Maybe it's devoting ourselves to a cause like this beautiful coalition. There's 1,000 ways each one of us, says Frankel, has to find our own unique meaning, that our own unique life is calling out to us. When we help people find this purpose, right, to name it, to face it, and to replace the darkness with light, everything changes. And we break the cycle, and we move back out into the light, and we redeem our loved ones. I'll end with this. In 2014, do you know what the #1 Googled search was? Well, if it was 2014, it probably wouldn't have been all that surprising. And I have a video clip I'm not going to share just because I've gone over a little bit of time. Robin Williams suicide. Robin Williams suicide was the #1 Googled phrase. It was 2014, I believe, maybe 2015. But out of all the searches, why? Because we intuited something heartbreaking about Robin Williams. It didn't make sense. He seemed so happy, but there was so much darkness. He seemed to be the smiles and the outward image of I'm fine. And if he's not fine, what about the people who really aren't fine or are outwardly showing they're not fine? He seemed to be somebody who wasn't doing the void dance. He seemed to be somebody who was free of pain and suffering. He's so happy. And yet we saw with Robin Williams, Stephen King saying, monsters are real and they live in our head. And sometimes they win. And it struck a chord in all of us, everybody that year and probably thereafter, and hopefully continues to strike a chord, that people can be too superficial, and we just accept the I'm fine and we walk right past them. But the next time we know somebody is struggling in darkness, to help stop, to see them, compassion with suffering, to stop and to sit with them for a moment in their suffering, not to fix their suffering. I've been married 21 years. My wife is still working on that. Stop trying to fix it. Just sit there and hold it. And holding somebody's suffering and giving them voice, helping them name it, and helping them face it, and helping them replace it is enough. Last image, I promise. A person dies 2 deaths, once when their body dies and once when their story dies. There's nothing you can do about the death of your loved one. I don't care if it was suicide. It wasn't your fault. Remember that Robin Williams movie, Good Will Hunting? Holding Matt Damon's character, Will? It's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Say it 10,000 times until they believe it. It's not your fault. Hold them and then remind them. The person doesn't have to die 2 deaths. Once when the body dies and once when their story dies. You are a guardian of their story. You are guarding their flame, as I call it, their fire. Carry their fire forward by living. Not by surviving, but by living more fully, by loving more fiercely, by finding your why, your spark, and taking that spark and illuminating a darkened world. And in that way, you will have redeemed the tragedy, and you will have broken the cycle, and you will have brought goodness out of destruction, emergence out of emergency. And so that's the work you all are doing. And I just came to say thank you, to help maybe give you a context that maybe you have, maybe you haven't thought about, and now open it up for any questions if you do have any questions. And I see a few on the side privately. Feel free to share them privately or publicly or verbally. I'm happy to have you jump in as well.
I love that. Thank you. I really loved that concept. You're the guardian of their story there at the end to close that out. That's fantastic. A good thing to keep in mind, definitely. If you have questions, please type them into the chat box, and we can facilitate those for him. Or as he said, just go ahead and speak up. There's not so many of us that I think we wouldn't all talk over each other. So please feel free to take this time and ask questions. We still have quite a bit of time.
So I was, Chris Stewart asked me, what do I think about the concept of miracles? If it's okay, Chris, I'll just read this. This may be too deep, but my folks are called miracles after severe brain injury. Pros and cons of thinking of a self as a miracle. So the primary difference between logotherapy and traditional psychotherapy is that Viktor Frankl's premise was that we are a soul. He called it the nous, or noetic. We are a soul, and we happen to have a body and a mind and emotions. And that's the starting point. It's not a religious necessarily concept, but it's a starting point. And our soul is always whole. Our soul doesn't become tainted with all of the stuff of life, all of the neuroses, etc. And so that is a miracle. I mean, teacher of mine, Wayne Dyer, is probably my primary teacher in life. You probably know Rabbi Wayne Dyer, the greatest man to ever have lived and teach. In my opinion, not the greatest, one of the greatest. I don't want to get into any theological conversations. He talks about how you are a miracle. As he says, you're the sperm that won the race. You are a miracle by the fact that you are here against all odds. It is miraculous. So I think the miracle is that we are here at all. I don't think it's a stretch to talk about miracles. I think it's a miracle when somebody finds their way back to their soul after having felt like it was stripped from them. And anybody who's survived suicide, death in general, suicide in particular, knows what it's like to feel like your soul is gone. It's not gone. It's just been covered over. And so we help people find their way back to the noetic, the soul. That's a miracle. Brad just shared his appreciation and also the importance of the movie Good Will Hunting. It was not about suicide. It was about surviving a physical abuse, emotional abuse, but nonetheless, still an amazing movie. Thanks, Brad. Thank you, Chris.
So I know that this is being recorded. I'm wondering if it's something that we can potentially share with others. I think a lot of what you've touched on, I coordinate the loss team, sorry. And a lot of what you touched on is what we talk about with people that we're working with. But just, you say it so eloquently, and sometimes we have people who don't want the in-person visit. I'd love to be able to share your words with those that we're trying to reach, if that's okay.
Yeah, they're not my words. They're great wisdom traditions I've just gathered together, so share them freely. And that's what I do for a living. I work with individuals and I speak to communities on these topics. So however I can help to give voice to any of your organizations or those whom you serve, I'd be honored to.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Are you familiar, Rabbi B, with the loss team, or would you like Sarah to explain a little bit about what that is?
I'd love to learn more about you all.
Because it's a national program too, so it's in several different states.
Please.
So the Kim Foundation and Region 6 came together and formed a loss team for the metro area. It stands for Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors. And we are a team of volunteers who are people who have lost loved ones to suicide, and then we also have clinicians on the team. So we receive notification from law enforcement of deaths in our community, and then we reach out to next of kin and those who are impacted to offer resources and support throughout our community. So thanks to the people at Kim Foundation, especially, we've been able to formulate that team. We have 25 people on our team right now, and growing. And actually in the state of Nebraska, we're up to 9, right, Julia? Teams in the state of Nebraska?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, it's nationwide. So we went to California last year. They only have 2 teams in California. So Nebraska's winning.
That's amazing. Thank you for your work. And, it's just so important to remember for people on this call and the lost team, who heals the healers. I carried so much suffering for so long, 500 funerals and everything that comes with being clergy, that I just remember feeling crushed sometimes under the weight. And just so it's so important to remember to heal the healers as well as heal those whom you're guiding.
Absolutely.
Well, and I just wanted to share with everybody kind of how this happened, that if it wasn't, seeing everybody's faces on Zoom reminds me of those old shampoo commercials that said, and so on and so on and so on, right? And that's how I think things grow. It's been my involvement in this coalition and doing this work, and with community members, some who are on this call as well, listening to this today, that really sparked my interest and started putting more work out into the Jewish community, which I happen to work in. I happen to not be Jewish myself, but I work in the Jewish community. And so as a result of that, Rabbi B's mom said, well, did you know that my son wrote this book and who he is? And so she brought me his book, and I read his book, and I didn't read it from obviously a Jewish connection or context, but I read it just from the work that we're all doing and absolutely loved it, and just wanted to hear more and to share more. And that's how he and I got connected, was what can we do together? How can we send this message to people just about not accepting death and staying in the dark, but how do we turn that into, again, being a spark seeker and seeing it positive? And again, you have to embrace the dark, but then you, at some point, have to turn to the light, or you die yourself, either figuratively or literally. So anyway, I just wanted to share my connection, but it really started with, again, if it weren't for this coalition and everything that we're all doing together, none of this would have happened. So
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Karen, for making this connection. Are you guys able to still do the session you guys were going to do together?
no, that was going to be last night.
Oh, okay.
And we didn't because I know he's, I just am a couple reasons that we didn't. One is sometimes I think everybody's like Zoom done, with a lot of trainings. And the other thing is I was pretty nervous about doing something regarding suicide on Zoom and then not being in a room where we could take care of people or see people or be available to people. And so I really probably got a little fearful myself, just not wanting to do that on Zoom. So
that
was my reasoning.
Yeah, that's understandable for sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions or thoughts that you want to share with the group, or questions for him? Okay, well, hearing none, I just want to thank you so much for being here with us today and to learn your Omaha and Nebraska roots. That's awesome. Thank you. And I'll make sure to get this recording to you as well once I figure out the best way. I'll probably do it in like Dropbox or something, but we'll figure that part out.
Wonderful. I really appreciate this opportunity to reconnect with my homeland. So thank you. And I put my contact information in the chat. You just Google Rabbi B, you'll get my website. You can send me an email at rabbib@rabbib.com, but would love to hear from you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And with that, really, our agenda, I just want to remind everybody, we do not meet, well, we have room or time, I guess, for the roundtable discussion. If people, we kind of did that at the start to see if anyone had any announcements or thoughts on anything. Just a reminder, if you've been with us the last 2 Zoom meetings for this coalition, we have decided not to do the breakouts via Zoom, just because of logistics and trying to get everybody coordinated with that. And we didn't want to add additional meetings to people's calendars. So my hope, we don't meet in July. So my hope would be by August, maybe we can all be together. But we will communicate that as soon as we know with everybody. Please do note at the end of the agenda there, the August meeting it had to be moved to Thursday, August 27th, due to some scheduling conflicts with Boys Town, where the meetings will be hosted. And we'll just leave, even if we have to go via Zoom, we're gonna leave it on the Thursday as opposed to Tuesday. So we'll make sure to get that calendar invite out to you very early so it's blocked off on your calendars, but just make note of that for the August meeting. And with that, I just want to thank everybody again for being here. Hopefully everyone's staying healthy and enjoying these a little cooler summer days we've had this week. So with that, please take care and just email us with any announcements or things you want to share with the group or questions you have. And again, Rabbi B, thank you so much for being here with us. And to your mom too, if she's on there, she's a great supporter of ours. I'm not sure if she's still with us, but thank you for joining us and making that connection too. So.
Thanks.
All right, everybody take care. Bye-bye.